A very good afternoon to all of you. This is Dr. Beena Gandhi, Deputy Director Research, SAARC Cultural Centre. On behalf of SAARC Cultural Centre, I welcome you all to another interesting SAARC Talk Series 2025. I especially thank His Excellency Purna Bahadur Nepali, Ambassador of Nepal to Sri Lanka, Nepal Embassy, for joining us online. Thank you very much, sir. Our speaker this afternoon is Bhushita Vasistha, who is a Nepali writer and a Fulbright scholar with an MFA in creative writing from San José State University, USA. She has worked as a fiction editor at Read Magazine, a reader for the Steinbeck Fellowship, and formerly led editorial work at Nepalaya publication in Kathmandu. Alongside her editorial and creative work, she has given lectures on literature, feminism, and Sanskrit poetics across literary festivals in South Asia. This afternoon, she is going to speak on a very pertinent topic: Nepal, the Phantom Colony, Rethinking South Asian Post-Colonialism Beyond the Borders of Empire. This topic addresses a critical gap in our scholarly discourse. Nepal was never being formally colonized by any European powers, but it remains curiously absent from global post-colonial discourse. This talk explores Nepal as a phantom colony, a state that escaped direct colonization but mirrored many colonial dynamics by proximity. We are eager to hear more. So now let us invite Bhushita Vasistha to speak to start her presentation.
Thank you so much, Beena. Good afternoon, everybody. It has been an absolute pleasure getting to know you and working alongside with you. And at this moment, I would also like to extend my special gratitude to Nepal's ambassador to Sri Lanka, His Excellency Purna Bahadur Nepali, also incidentally a Fulbright scholar, Fulbright alumni. So he was instrumental in connecting me with SAARC Cultural Centre. So thank you so much for your galvanizing presence here today with us. With that said, I would also like to draw the attention to the fact that it is an absolute milestone for me, a 90s kid, to be speaking as one of the speakers for the SAARC Talk Series, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. For those who were not young enough to remember, back in those times, SAARC was equivalent of G20 for us, and it was emblematic of regional conglomeration, regional political aspirations. So, as I said earlier, I would like to reiterate it is an absolute milestone. With that said, and the formalities done and dusted with, I would like to introduce you all to today's topic. Today, I chose to speak on a topic which is rather complex. Those of you who have decided to study postcolonialism know that it is notorious for being very incomprehensible at times because it's laden with jargons and really specific lingo of social science. But today, my effort will be to make it as palatable and as comprehensible to layman's tongue as it is possible. So, that said, I would like to move to my next slide. So, this is a story time. I'm basically a writer, a fiction writer, and I believe that the most complex ideas can be effectively communicated when we break them down into small children's story. So, in order to enter into the topic of Nepal as a phantom colony in the context of larger post-colonial studies, I would like to recall a story I heard as a child. So basically, I grew up in the southern plains in Nepal, and I grew up with my parents and my aunt, who was a divorcee, and she had been an augmenting factor in my childhood. She was the one I was closest to. So as a child, when I would want to go out and play with my friends, I was allowed in the daytime, but in the dark, I was absolutely forbidden to go out in the dark. And my parents and my aunt, they were more lenient towards my elder brother. He could go out and play with his friends in the dark, but I was absolutely forbidden. So the curious child that I was, as all children are curious, and I was curious, so I demanded a logic as why darkness was so scary. Although I was scared of darkness, but I wanted to understand why is it so scary. So my aunt told me a story of a witch, which we call Kichkanya or Kichkanni in Nepali. So my aunt told me a story of a man, and this is the story I would like to begin this presentation with. Once upon a time, there was a man who had to cross the mountains to reach a village. It was quite far away, a day's walk. But he made three mistakes that day. The first mistake was he should have set out early in the morning for the walk, but he was a late riser like me. So he started late in the afternoon. And he started walking, but he was the sort of man which, in the modern lingo, they would call sapiosexual, or the man who is intellectually aroused or attracted to the people. So he was consumed in his thought. He was walking through the village, through the mountain, and so consumed was he in his thought, he made the second mistake of the day, that it was only after it was sunset he realized he was past the last village where he could have taken the shelter. So it was already dark, and the darkness was closing in from all sides, and he had no option but to walk into the forest and walk towards the village. So he kept walking. In the beginning, he was like, okay, I can take it. But as he moved further into the denser part of the forest, the ferocious ambient forest noise started to scare him, and he started to long for a companion, a shelter, distraction, anything. And that was when he saw a silhouette of a person in front of him. So he ran towards the silhouette, and sure enough, it was a woman, an extremely beautiful woman on white cloth, long black hair. So he was so relieved, and he said, where are you going? And the woman was incidentally going to the same village. So he said, oh, maybe we can walk together. And they started walking together. The girl was as intellectually stimulating, as astute as she was beautiful. And the man was, as I said, he was a sapiosexual. He was very attracted to the woman. So they had a really good time. He forgot about the darkness. He forgot about the wild animals, the nocturnal noise. They started walking. But after a while, the man got a little tired, but the woman was surprisingly not tired at all. So the man said, why don't we rest here for a while? There was a lake in the middle of the forest, and it was a clear night, moonlit night. The reflection of the star was visible on the sheet of the water. So the man said, why don't we rest here for a while? And the woman agreed, and they started to rest for a while. And that was when the thought struck the mind that this woman is so beautiful, she's so astute, and she's so fearless. She's walking alone in the night. Why don't I propose her to marry me? Because it can't get any better than this. So as he thought of proposing the woman, the thought occurred to him, but before I propose to her, maybe I look into the reflection of myself in the water to check that I look all right. So he looked into the reflection in the lake. I don't know how clear the reflection was, but as the story goes, he looked into the reflection, and then he was stunned. He was stunned because the woman was sitting next to him, but the water only reflected his reflection. And that's how he knew this woman was a witch who was waiting to eat his heart. So this is what my aunt told me. There are like witches who roam around in the night, who are waiting to eat your heart as they take you to the darkest of the dark. There were certain things about this story that stayed with me for a long time. Sure, indeed, I was afraid of the dark more so than I was before, and I carried mirror with me everywhere just to be able to detect a witch when she was there. But as I grew up as a woman, as I gradually grew from a child to a woman, I realized that the story was not just a story about a witch, but it was an actual story of a woman who was beautiful, who was intellectually astute, who was fearless, who dared to walk her own path, who was perceived as a threat to a society. And in response, she was denied the reflection in the society. And the way you make someone a ghost, you make a ghost of a person, is by denying them a reflection. The reason I'm recounting this story today before we enter the topic of phantom colony is the fact that when I went to the US, when I went to the US in 2022-2024 as a Fulbright scholar to study creative writing program at San José State. This is what I experienced as a brown creative writing student in the library, in the World Library of the American University, where Nepali literature was nowhere reflected. It was rendered a phantom. We did not have reflection in the larger mirror of the global literature. So I was the only brown person in the first 2 semesters of the fiction workshop that I was taking. And my thesis novel was based on Nepali Civil War, which was fought between Nepali insurgents and the state of Nepal from 1996 to 2006. It was a defining war because it is one of the only communist wars that sort of like took place in the 20th century at that point. So it was really interesting from anthropological point of view, socio-political point of view. But when I submitted the first chapters for the workshop, most of my classmates, who were otherwise extremely well-read people, they admitted that they did not know anything about the war. And actually, forget about the war, most of them did not even know about Nepal for that matter. And those people who knew about Nepal knew about it through Mount Everest. So they were extremely surprised when I told them I was from the flatter plains, the southern plains of Nepal. And to an extent, that was understandable because Nepal had never been colonized by white people. So they were not obligated to remember us. But when I learned the fact, as the only non colonized brown person in the postcolonialism class, right? Like I'm sitting here in the class, and when you are a brown person in a class dominated by white people, there is a certain lens they look at you. There are certain ideas. Most of the time, when I went into my college, everybody perceived me as Indian because Indian identity is what has been established firmly through literature, through employment opportunities, through movie representation. India is the template. People learn to see a person like me. So they immediately thought I was Indian. As the only non-colonized brown person in the class, I joked that it would have been better, if we were actually colonized, because having a powerful enemy to blame is half the therapy already, right? Like, that's the zeitgeist anyway. So jokes aside, the postcolonialism class was a wonderful introduction to the contextual study of literature from colonial states like India, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Algeria, Sri Lanka, for that matter, China, and Korea, and other colonized nations. I had already read the work of writers like Salman Rushdie and Arundhati Roy, but I got introduced to the work of Ngugi Thiong'o and Titsi Dangarembga, among others, who have won critical acclaim on their own. But being braided into the larger narratives of postcolonialism gave them the exposure into college textbooks worldwide and granted longevity that prizes alone cannot. For example, The God of Small Thing did win Booker Prize, but how many Booker Prizes have the longevity that The God of Small Thing enjoys? So I realized that when you are given a political scaffolding, a contextual background to appreciate the literature, it gains a longevity. The classroom discussion sort of made me wonder, why has Nepali literature yet to receive the global attention all our neighboring countries are receiving, and what can be done to bridge the gap? That's when I started studying about it seriously. So it led me to few discoveries. Today, I'm addressing a SAARC talk, so it would be relevant for us here. When we look into the formation of states, at least within the SAARC region, Nepal is one of the oldest states. The nation state is a rather new concept. It was promulgated in the West in the 17th century, and it sort of like traveled across Southeast Asia. But even before the concept of nation state was calcified, Nepal has existed as a political entity, and it is the oldest states in the SAARC region. The modern Nepal was formed in 1768. Now compare that to Bhutan, the second oldest, which attained the modern framework in 1907, Afghanistan in 1919. India and Pakistan in 1947, Sri Lanka in 1948, Maldives in 1963, and so on and so forth. So despite being one of the oldest nation states, oldest political entities in the region, with a very robust oracular literary system, why can we not find Nepal in any of the South Asian studies or post-colonial literature? So there is an interesting work. There was an interesting scholar called Mary Deschines. She's an anthropologist. She has raised a question which resonated with me strongly when I was a Fulbright scholar in the US. She asks, where is Nepal in South Asia? So where is Nepal in South Asia? So in the paper, she says, if countries were vowels, Nepal would fall into the sometimes category. Depending on the context and perspective, Nepal is included in South Asia or absent altogether. This reflects how area studies frameworks often marginalize Nepal, from conference listings that omitted to the hiring practices that exclude Nepali specialists from South Asianist roles. To give a context to that, about 2 weeks ago, I was in Berkeley. I was in Oakland in California, where a Fulbright scholar, Swasti Raz Bhandari, so just to give you the context of what I was talking about, my friend Swasti Raz Bhandari, who is an Nepali art curator and a scholar, she's currently in Asian Art Museum in California as a visiting Fulbright scholar. She asked me the same question Mary Deschines has been asking for a long time. She, as a Nepali scholar, she went to the US and she tried to see the footprints of Nepali artists. And obviously, the first subcategory to look into that would be South Asian artist. So she went there and looked for Nepali artists, and there was almost no representation. Then her instinct was to go and search for Nepali artist in another subcategory called the Himalayan artist. And there too, there was a disproportionate or almost no representation. And this was the question we were discussing. Where do we find Nepali writers and where do we find Nepali artists? Because the category which was supposed to reflect Nepal geographically, Nepal houses 8 of the 10 tallest Himalayan ranges in the world, and yet ironically the Himalayan artist so far does not, Himalayan artist or Himalayan artist writers so far does not include Nepali writers and artists. In that paper, she poses an interesting question called the Tamil Nadu question. So what is this Tamil Nadu question? In the paper, she describes an anecdote where there was a job vacancy for a scholarly position in an academic setting in the US. The interviewer was a woman, a white woman who was an expert in South Asian studies, and her work was based in Tamil Nadu in India. So she was interviewing for the position of South Asian expert, and the interview was a Nepali. So she asked the scholar the question, how can you teach South Asia when you are based in Nepal? And then the Nepali scholar replied, what makes a village in Tamil Nadu more representative of South Asia than some place in Nepal? This is an interesting question because this question exposes an unexamined assumption that true South Asia must be anchored in India. And this is, I think, true not just with Nepal, but places like Bhutan and Maldives, which were also incidentally never colonized. So for countries like Nepal, Maldives, Bhutan, we fall into the structural penumbra that denies the reflection of these regions which exist geographically, but epistemologically, these regions are not granted representation within the framework where these places should have belonged. So when did this bias begin? That is the question I would like to address here. When we talk about this prejudice of seeing Nepal as a derivative state of India or a minor state of India, we can trace it back to at least 100 years. In the 1890s, the director of the Ethnographic Survey of India described Nepal as a sort of debatable land between Aryan India and Mongolian territory, drawing the rank and file of its population from Tibet and the leaders, intellectual and social, from India. This is what this is the tone. This is the tone that was set in 1896, and as late as last week in 2025, we are still within this fold. We're still thinking that Nepal is a debatable land that maybe or may not be. It exists in the cleavages of in the small cleavages between India and other colonized states in South Asia, which have greater representation in post-colonial studies. So Mary Deschines, in that groundbreaking essay titled "Is Nepal Even in South Asia?" Where is Nepal? Nepal is geographically in South Asia, but it is nowhere granted representation. So she asks the question, is Nepal even in South Asia? Obviously, she does not mean geographically, but epistemologically. She points out that South Asian studies as a discipline emerged from the colonial knowledge system. If we look at some of the giants of post-colonial theories, Gayatri Spivak comes to my mind, Homi K. Bhabha, they had Indian connection. And South Asian studies is indebted to post-colonial theories and post-colonial methodology because it was post-colonial theory that sensitized the white academia to the sentient, the aesthetics of South Asian literature as something worthy of attention and studying. Post-colonial studies centered on colonized states like India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Nepal, never colonized, fell outside this framework. It was treated as a frontier, a curiosity, a Shangri-La, if you may, a museum of ancient practices, but it was not humanized enough to be recognized as a participant in the post-colonial conversation. And this is what I mean by the witch without the reflection. We existed as a physical entity, but when I searched for my own reflection in the global literature, the literature that boasted that it marks a global representation, the literature that was audacious enough to call itself global literature, when I looked into that mirror, I did not find my reflection. Nepal existed as an entity, but it was nowhere reflected. In anthropology, this exclusion took the form of objectification without dialogue. Nepal as this Shangri-La land, as this romantic, distant dream that is apotheosized. But in literature, it took the form of non-translation and non-inclusion. Nepali writers like Lakshmi Prasad Devkota, Parijat, and Bhupi Sershan, especially Lakshmi Prasad Devkota and Leknath Podal, who were contemporary to T.S. Eliot, and their poetry, if you analyze, if we see them on a pure literary merit basis, they were conversant with the global literature. The metaphors and the frames, the iteration of modern poetry, as T.S. Eliot was speaking about, somehow the theory had its resonance in the works of Lakshmi Prasad Devkota and Leknath Podal, but they were nowhere included. Their works were not translated and they were not included in the global literati, and they were never canonized. Their themes, if you really look into it, resonated with the global post-colonial literature, but the framework was not built to recognize them. So what happened in turn was it turned Nepal into what I would like to call is a phantom colony. This is a term I have coined myself when I was studying in the US. What does a phantom colony mean? Nepal resisted empire. Nepal is 22 times small the size of India, and yet despite its small size and the resources, it was successful in resisting empire physically, although in the larger scheme of things, unfortunately, the Rana oligarchs, they pandered to the white masters' notions of civilization. But on a pure physical basis, Nepal resisted empire militarily, politically, but it did remain embedded in the colonial circuits. But despite that, the borders of Nepal, as we know today, were drawn under British guidance. To give you an example, the tallest mountain in the world, we all know the tallest mountain in the world is Mount Everest, but this is not the Nepali name. This is not how we call this mountain. The name for this mountain is Sagarmatha, but this name was given by a British explorer. It was named after the British explorer who came for the cartographic expedition here. In the similar fashion, just as the borders were drawn under the British guidance, Nepali soldiers also fought in imperial wars. They definitely fought in world wars, and they were the pawns in the imperial wars. Our economy was also dependent on colonial trade. Nepal is a landlocked country, so strategically also, whether we want it or not, just by the mere virtue of its landlockedness, Nepali economy did depend on colonial trade by and large. And eventually, finally, its intellectual traditions were sidelined as Orientalism created its own canon. And despite all these things, Nepali borders were drawn under British guidance. Our soldiers fought the imperial war. Our economy was braided, intertwined with the colonial trade. And despite all of this, simply because the nomenclature of the existing post-colonial theory fails to recognize states like Nepal, Ethiopia, and Thailand that were not fully colonized, but nevertheless they function as the satellite colonies for the white masters, because these sort of states have not been theorized so far in the existing post-colonial theories. In the latter day, in the modern context, where our main vantage point to appreciate and study South Asian literature comes from the framework of post-colonial study, the literature from this part of the world were simply rendered phantoms, like they were ghosted out. They were not studies because they were not studied because they were not given a contextual framework. So this is the poster you could have seen in this is the picture I included in the poster for today's talk, and this is an interesting photo. I find it really interesting when I read about it because this picture was taken in 1948, a year after India gained its independence. And there is a team of 60 Nepali porters who are carrying a luxury car, arguably Mercedes Benz, on their shoulder. So this is why is this picture so poignant is in 1948, the year after India gained its independence, India was already extensively connected to the world through railroads and intellectually connected to the world through its art and literature. At that time, Nepal still did not have roads. There was no connectivity. Nepal had its first democratically elected government in 1951, and it was open to the world in 1953. The first anthropologist who extensively worked in Nepal arrived in Christoph von Heimendorf. He arrived in Nepal in 1953, and that's when Nepal as a political entity was recognized in the Western academia. But this year, until 1948, we were still pulling the luxury car on our shoulders. So this picture, this picture, men carrying a luxury car on their shoulder, tells us something about how modernity arrived in Nepal. It arrived awkwardly, symbolically, and dramatically delayed. At the same time, the colonized nations like India and elsewhere, they were already building railways, printing manifestos, and preparing for independence. Nepal remained in a political freeze time, and there are certain anthropologists, and this has been extensively contested idea, who called Nepal a fossil state. So until that time, until 1951, Nepal was in a political freeze frame. As I said earlier, Nepal was ruled by the Rana oligarchs from 1846 to 1951, when it eventually promulgated democracy. During that period, the oligarchs had secluded. There was a watertight border and nobody was allowed to come inside the country. So it remained in a state of political freeze frame. It was nominally sovereign. Actually, Nepal is one of the oldest nation states, as I said earlier, and Nepal had its diplomatic mission in Britain as early as 1934, which was a decade before India achieved its independence. But despite the nominal sovereignty, it remained close to the world until 1951. So this moment sets the tone for our conversation today. How do we account for Nepal in the post-colonial world if it was never formally colonized? So how do we locate countries like Nepal? About 4 years ago, I read an article by Ajit Baral, a friend and a renowned publisher and editor. He was pondering about the dystopian future of Nepali publishing. And at that time, I was working as a publishing editor at Publications Nepal. And every week, I dove into the slush pile, retrieving the manuscript that I personally thought was worthy of global readership. And yet, Ajit was right. We did not have any international market, and the once robust domestic market was also shrinking dramatically. So, Ajit's article talked about J.N. Atten, who published the first book in Nepal, Grammar of Nepali Literature, in 1820. That year marked the 63rd year of East India Company's arrival and eventual colonization of India, the seventh largest country in the world by land area. Imagine that. It was a miracle that Nepal, which is about 22 times smaller the size of India, resisted full colonization. But although this is a matter of pride for a lot of Nepali, in true reflection, like as I ponder over this issue, I feel like this isolation had its consequences. For one, when imperialism gave way to the political awakening of South Asia in the 1940s, India and China had already extensive rail and road connections that covered significant national and international destinations. But until 1951, Nepal was closed to the world, forbidding foreigners from entering this kingdom. In the age of roving empires, Nepal managed to escape the colonization entirely, fermenting a robust and oracular literary system. And I stress here, oracular literary system. So much of, I am the second generation college goer in my family. My mother was the first to go to school and attend the college. But until my mother's generation, my grandmothers and the women prior and men, basically, literacy was passed on orally. And even today, some of our greatest poems in Nepal, the literary tradition, we remember our poetry by heart because they are designed in prosodies. Leknath Paudel wrote in iambic octameter, albeit like Shakespeare, and his work has not been introduced to the larger world, which I think is an absolute injustice to the global readership because they are such a gem. But these works are designed to be memorized and recited. For example, even today, if I have to remember the work, we remember them already, like Kothama kasari paso najar ki shringara chainau timi yatro shoka kahau kaha hridaya ki आधार छैनौ तिमी. So this is an example of how the literature was designed to be passed on orally. However, the Western academia, being phallogocentric, it has two biases. The first bias, as we talked about earlier, is the lens of seeing Nepal as a debatable land between Aryan and Mongolian civilization, seeing Nepal as a derivative civilization of India. And another fallacy or another prejudice which prevented Nepali literature from reading the global audience was phallogocentrism. Phallogocentrism is a term coined by Jacques Derrida, and it refers to the philosophical and cultural dominance of masculine perspective and values, particularly as expressed through language, especially written language. It combines phallocentrism, the privilege of the masculine viewpoint, and logocentrism, the focus on written language as the primary means of creating meaning. So in Nepal, Ajit, again, in that interview, Ajit said that the first book was published in Nepal from 1820. So from 1820 to 1950, only about 1,100 books, only 1,500 books were published in Nepali, out of which 1,100 were printed outside of Nepal. So basically, although there was a robust oracular literary tradition in Nepal, we did not have the inclination, the training to document or archive them into written words. So Nepali literature until very recently was predominantly an oracular literature. But because the Western academia has prejudice against the spoken word as the authentic carriers of truth, so Nepali literature which primarily existent in oracular forms, is not granted the gravitas it maybe commands. So I talked a lot about postcolonialism, and then maybe not every one of you is familiar with the concept. But this is an interesting framework for us, especially South Asian intellectuals, artists, and writers, because it is the genre-defining methodology that gave exposure to South Asian literature. So what is postcolonialism? It refers to both historical condition, the period following the end of formal colonial rule, and a critical methodology. It examines the economic, political, cultural, and epistemological consequences of colonialism and how they continue to the date, how they continue to shape post-independent societies. So there are certain questions that post-colonial theory asks. How did colonial power shape knowledge, identity, and culture in colonized societies? How do formerly colonized people reclaim voice and agency in the face of historical erasure? And what does resistance look like in literature, in politics, and in memory? And this is an important framework because if Nepal is not given the framework to answer these questions, there is no way we can build the context to take Nepali literature to the global audience. So why is this important? Postcolonialism and literature. Postcolonial theory has radically reshaped how we read and teach literature everywhere. In the earlier times, the literary canons were dominated by Euro-American texts, and they were considered universal. I'll give you an example. I grew up in the southern plains of Nepal, as I said earlier, and when I went to the school, we had the alphabet book, you know, the little printed book with colorful paintings to teach alphabets to the kids. So the first alphabet, A, was denoted by a delicious, succulent looking apple. So they said A for apple. But I grew up in the time where the villagers produced all the produce that they consumed, vegetables and fruits. So I had never really seen an apple when I was growing up as a child. I had seen monkey fruit, I had seen jamuns, I had seen mangoes, but I had never really seen an apple. So I also grew up studying. I also like to speak in English, to study English literature is to inherit the Western vantage point. And me knowing A as an A as denoting apple without knowing what apple tastes or look like is an example to that. But post-colonial criticism changed that to an extent. And it shattered this hierarchy by recovering suppressed voices, especially from Africa, Caribbean states, South Asian states, and indigenous writers became central to literary discussions. And we were also rethinking languages and forms, especially writers like Chinua Achebe and Salman Rushdie to an extent. They appropriated, and also Arundhati Roy, they appropriated and transformed the English language to express culturally specific reality. And this was a huge revolution from English language. From English language, the global literature shifted towards languages in English, and that is thanks to the sensitization brought about by postcolonialism. And eventually, what postcolonialism it also did is challenging linear progress. Histories were retold from the viewpoint of colonized, revealing traumas and resistance and cultural resilience. We can also talk about neo-historicism and so on and so forth, but I'm afraid they fall outside the scope of our talk today. So I'll try to be brief. So in this framework, so to summarize, in the global literature, the South Asian literature are seen, are appraised, are appreciated from the lens of post-colonial commentary, post-colonial theory. But Nepal, although it functioned as a phantom colony, it is not granted the status of colonial, post-colonial state, because of which we cannot talk about our literature in the same breath that Indian writers, for example, can talk about. So Nepal presents a paradox. It was never colonized. It's a source of pride in national memory. It also retained its sovereignty as the British Empire engulfed the rest of South Asia. But this sovereignty also meant Nepal was left out of the formal decolonization discourse and the robust post colonial traditions that followed. The historical position has several implications, some of which are seclusion from global post-colonial discourse. As I said earlier, Nepal was not subject to direct colonial rule, so it lacks the specific legacy of imperial administration, the racial hierarchies, the Raj, the Memsabs, the language, the formal liberation movement that animate post-colonial literature elsewhere. As a result, Nepali literature has not been widely incorporated in global post-colonial studies, is one of my conclusions. The second factor is colonialism without colonization. When Nepal skipped direct colonization, it was deeply shaped by colonial modernity through indirect British influence, missionary education, regional geopolitics, and trade. These effects were internalized by elites, visible in how modernization and nationalisms were articulated, and also to the extent the neoclassical buildings of the regimen, of the rulers, of the Rana rulers. The architecture also reflects these influences. And finally, the internal colonialism. Nepal's exclusion from post colonial discourse is also complicated by internal hierarchies. Scholars argue that Nepal have our own marginalized communities such as Janajatis, Madhesis, and Dalits, and their experience forms internal colonization. So they are like stratas of colonial discourses we could have within Nepal, and that could mirror the dynamics of imperialism within the nation state. So finally, why should we even talk about this? Why do we even need to theorize it? I think the marginal position of Nepal and countries like Nepal. Nepal is not only one country. I talked about countries like Ethiopia, Bhutan, Maldives, Thailand. So, position of these countries in a post-colonial theory is not just an academic oversight. It reveals the limits of a discourse that has often privileged the colonizer binary while overlooking in between states like Nepal, Ethiopia, and Thailand. Those that remain politically sovereign but culturally entangled. We are as much scarred and impacted by colonialism as rest of these countries, but since we are not given the status, we have nowhere to unravel our story. So Nepal's position invites us to expand post-colonial theory beyond formal colonization. This is what I really want to do: initiate, start, or theorize a new theory of phantom colonies. Recognize the power of regional hegemony, especially India's influence in shaping identity for states like Nepal, and re-examine how nationalism, language, and power operate in post-colonial like contexts. So to conclude, post-colonialism has transformed our understanding of literature, identity, and power, but it must also transform itself by grappling with cases like Nepal and other states which were treated like satellite colonies. Nepal's literary and political history offers fertile ground for rethinking what it means to be post-colonial in a world where colonial influence often existed without formal conquest. So as we continue to decolonize knowledge and institution, the story of Nepal reminds us that sovereignty is not the same as freedom, and that erasure can happen even in the absence of rule. So with that, I would like to open the floor for Q&As or comments, anything you would like to share here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bhushita, for the thought-provoking presentation. Your concept of Nepal as a phantom colony has opens up exciting new avenues for post-colonial scholarship. So, as you said, I'm sure our online participants have many questions about this innovative theoretical approach.
And also, I would like to thank all of you for listening so patiently. I mean, it takes a lot of grace and curiosity to be listening to such a long discourse. My pardon, but this was the time I was granted. I hope it was worth your while. We can also take opinions rather than questions. I'm not an expert. I'm not only expert in the room, so we can take opinions.
So I have just one comment to make. Maybe it's not kind of related with your topic directly, but this first decade of the 20th century, it's in especially in Indian Nepali literature, it witnessed a gradual rise, especially in the Indian Nepali periodical.
So there has been a gradual raise, that is true, India, Nepal. But if you look at Indian literature or the literature of post-colonial states like Kenya and India, the rise is meteoric. And
Mm,
my argument is gradual is not enough. I think there is a possibility for the meteoric. So
mm,
that's what I'm trying to say. So
mm,
far, yes, in the regional context, Nepali literature has gained a gradual exposure. But when we extrapolate the framework to the global audience, then there is almost no sensitization about Nepali literature, even in modern times, even as recently as last
yeah.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, what I mentioned was the literary works which were produced in Nepali language in India.
Yes, that is right. India was the first place where Nepali literature was published. Banaras
Yeah,
was
but
our
not exactly. Mm.
primary site, and it continues. That
Yeah,
is.
yeah. So, do we have any questions? And important among them was this Gorkhe Khabar Kagat.
Yes. So these were the early publications, and there
Yeah.
is a Nepali scholar, Pratyush Onta, who has done an extensive work. He's talked about Nepali literature in the fossilized state. The term fossilized state being again coined by a white anthropologist who was visiting Nepal,
Mm,
who thought Nepal was a fossilized state because it was never reached by the outer world until 1951. So Pratik Swanta has done a lot of work about the literature in the early times, the Gorkha Khabar Patrika, as you said. Yeah,
mm.
they have a close link.
And I think many of these early kind of Bengali books were also translated into into Nepali.
I I think I have some people in the audience. I think there's also Atis Kaudinyan in the audience. I think there are people in the audience who can contribute meaningfully to this discourse. But yes, Bengali literature has cast a long shadow over Nepali literature, and there has been interregional translation. That is definitely true.
Mm.
It is true to an
Yeah.
extent that Bengali literature, Bengal has influenced Nepal in more than one way. Also, the Maoist insurgency coming from the direct contact with Naxalites. So there is a lot of ideological, aesthetic exchanges made between the Bengal in
Mm,
general, and
mm.
if there are no more questions, I think we can also take people's opinion. Yesterday,
Yeah.
when I posted this poster, somebody vehemently argued against me associating Nepal with the term colony. They thought it was a misnomer and oxymoron. So yeah, maybe we could also take opinions from the
Yeah.
audience.
So, do we have any comments from the audience, from the participants?
So actually, what is the point? You want to say that as a colony. So what is your opinion regarding this?
So my opinion regarding this is like I was a student. I was a Fulbright scholar in the U.S. And as a Nepali student, I was trying to locate. I was doing a research on where does Nepali literature exist in the global literati, and I was looking for the subcategories to find Nepal. So there were two subcategories that were pertinent to Nepali literature. One would be South Asian studies, and another would be Himalayan studies. In both the categories, Nepal is absolutely unrepresented. There is minuscule representation. And when I went into the root of this, there were certain researchers like Mary Deskin and Pratiswanta, some of whom I have quoted in the presentation. They argue that although Nepal falls in South Asia geographically, in the global literary discourse, Nepal has not been accepted as a South Asian state simply because it was not colonized. And because it was not colonized, the white masters did not feel the same sort of the need to virtue signal to Nepali literature, because of which Nepal does not have representation in the broader context. So I think there are countries like Nepal and Ethiopia and Thailand and Maldives
Bhutan.
and Bhutan. Yes, these places were not directly colonized, but we were indirectly colonized. We were indirectly colonized through soft power. But that kind of indirect colonization has not been theorized in post-colonial studies. So this is the time to start creating a theory about indirect colonization. So we can also grant space to countries, the literature of countries like these. There is a comment from Chudal, Alaka Chudal, I don't know. So she
Yeah.
writes, she has a comment. Sanskrit was also written in Bangla script. Sanskrit was, so many Nepalese people could read and understand it. Even the Bengali versions of Ramayana and Mahabharata were read by Nepalese people in the eastern part of Nepal in the hills in the 20th century. So to reiterate your point you're making earlier about the relationship between Bengali and Nepali literature. Thank you, Raji.
Yes, also Chaujapad, that is also very much connected with Nepali literatures.
Pardon me?
The Chaujapad, there is a collection of 12th, 11th and 12th centuries literature collection, Chaujapad, that is
Yes.
also connected with Nepali literature, with Bengali literature.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Mm.
Yes, I mean, there is a broader framework of a lot of literature written in Ranjana script, the Buddhist literature, some of which have found the relevance or resonance in the Western world as a prescriptive meditative text, but not as a literary canon. They're not appreciated in the same breath as to study their structure, the innovations, the genre that is lacking so far.
We have one more message. Many Nepali Theravadins were also trained in Calcutta, so we're closely connected.
No worries, Balkaji, you're doing a good job by.
Yeah, Miss Alaka, thank you very much for your observation. Okay, so I once again thank you, Bhushita, for accepting our invitation. It was a very, very engaging talk, and the question and the comments especially have actually highlighted the complexities of your theoretical contribution. That there is another one. I was told by one Bangladeshi scholar that first book in Bengal script was found in Nepal. The country may have not been colonized per se, but it was brought into the circulation of industrial commodities with comments coming from the audience. So, Ms. Bhushita, can you read the comments? Would you like to
Yes, I mean,
respond to
yeah.
that?
Yeah, there's a comment by Madhubanji. I'm not aware of this. I think this is contentious, but this is definitely a field of study. He's saying that one of the Bangladeshi scholars told him that the first book in Bengali script was found in Nepal. That would be amazing. So I'm not
Yeah,
aware of this.
that is Chaujapad.
Oh, so this is the book you were
That is the
talking
Chaujapad, yes. That is the earliest script in Bengali literature. It is
about.
found in Nepal.
Can you spell it out, sir, so I can?
Chaujapad. Chaujapad. This is a Chaujapad, yes.
Georgiapot. Okay, so it was apparently found in Beer Library, as Madhubanji helps
Yeah,
us.
it was in B Library.
And I certainly agree with Jamunaji. The country may not have been colonized per se, but it was brought into the circulation of industrial commodities with profound effects on countryside. Yes, she quotes. That is definitely true. Like we've entered the age of neo imperialism, definitely. Charyapad. So thank you, Alkaji. Sikdarji, is this Charyapad?
Yeah, it's true.
Charyapad.
We
Yes.
call it Chaujapad, but it is Charyapad, or this is actually is a collection of mystical poems and songs. This is the earliest evidence of a script, Bengali script
Oh. Oh.
collected from Nepal.
আমি বাঙালি ভাষা খুব ভালো লাগছে কিন্তু
Chaujapad, yeah.
Yeah, but I cannot speak. I really like it. Yeah. So that is interesting field of study. There is definitely connection. But what do you guys think about countries like Nepal and Bhutan and Maldives and Thailand and Ethiopia in the framework? How do we appreciate What is the framework we create?
So Bhushita, what I was thinking is that, as you said, you don't see in its reflection in the global context, but what was happening in Nepal during that time?
That's an interesting. So this is what was happening. So Nepal was, as I said, Nepal is a part of like Indian subcontinent, and the literary development is, per se with in keeping with the Shruti and the Smriti culture, as I said earlier. The
Like
literature,
Savai, what do you call it, Savai?
no, Savai also, but I'm not coming to Savai yet. I'm coming to
Lahari, Savai Lahari Geet.
Sawai and Lahari songs, yes. Alka Chudalji will be able to speak more on that. She's done an extensive research. She's actually published a book on Sawai and Lahari literature. She's also here with us in the audience. Yes. During that time, as I said, Nepali soldiers have fought in the world wars, like the imperial wars, and they came back and they brought the experiences. But because they were not literate enough to translate this experience in the written code, a lot of Nepali experiences became songs, Savai songs or Lahari songs, and they were passed on orally. So, in order to understand Nepali literature, I briefly touched upon phallogocentric prejudice. So, in order to understand literature of places like Nepal, we need to be open to the idea that knowledge transmission could also happen orally through folk song, through folk literature, through folk music. And I think that kind of open-mindedness is needed. Alaka Atreyaji has archived a lot of this folk music during the World War times, sang by the soldiers. So that was one aspect. And the other aspect was a lot of people were composing poetry, but they did not have resources to publish the published. So they were passed on orally in the family. So we need an appreciation of oral knowledge transmission system to be able to fully appreciate the oracular literature of Nepal.
So thank you, Bhushita. Thank you very much once again. And I think your work on Nepal as phantom colony isn't just kind of to fill a gap in our knowledge, but I think it also expands our understanding of how colonial power operated.
And continues to operate, like,
Yes.
to decide who has the right to tell the story.
Yeah. So thank you very much for sharing your work with us. Your lecture has given us so much to think about and will undoubtedly influence future scholarship in this area. So thank you all for joining us online, and we look forward to seeing you in our next SAARC Talk series.